As in any remote community without access to nearby aid, the inhabitants of Nantucket Island have always had a respect for the potential destruction and devastation that could be caused by fires. Their concern was heightened by the island economy's reliance on the storage of the flammable materials produced by the whaling industry, oil, spermaceti, and candles. In addition, almost without exception, the island's buildings were constructed of wood. As early as 1750, Nantucketers had invested in the firefighting equipment of the day. They established an overnight watch as a lookout for fires, and later established fire wardens and engine companies which were responsible for the use and maintenance of fire equipment. These preparations were timely and necessary. In 1903, the Enquirer and Mirror printed a record of the 287 fires that had occurred on Nantucket from 1736 to that date. Although most of them were confined to a single building, there were momentous exceptions. The Great Fire of 1846 will always stand as Nantucket's most extreme fire disaster, but as omens of the destruction to come, 2 fires struck the island in the preceding decade. The first fire took place in 1836, when a blaze broke out in Washington House, the dwelling of Elijah Starbuck, on the corner of Main and Union Streets. Before it could be brought under control, the fire had swept through 4 other dwellings and stores in the vicinity, consuming barns and small shops, at a cost of some $40,000. Volunteer fire companies pumped water from the cistern at the lower square of Main Street, which had been installed in 1833. And men and women formed bucket brigades to help battle the blaze and prevent it from spreading. An even worse fire, known as the Ropewalk Fire, originated in Joseph James Ropewalk, situated between Union and Washington Streets, when sparks from a steam engine ignited the stored materials. In the neighborhood were numerous oil sheds and oil and candle factories filled with highly combustible oil casks. A contemporary later wrote, "Those who are now living, whose memory reaches back to that night, will never forget the sight of the blazing oil that covered the waters of the harbor south of Commercial Wharf, nor the long tiers of iron hoops left standing in the sheds stored with thousands of barrels of oil. Though the fire wardens were able to use gunpowder to blow up several neighboring buildings and prevent the fire from spreading, the district was burnt as bare as the beach." This was an ominous test run for the Great Fire of 1846. The Asylum at Quaise was established by the town selectmen in 1822 to house the island's indigent poor and the debilitated. On a bitterly cold night, the asylum keeper's daughter-in-law awoke to find the 3-story structure on fire. She sounded the alarm, which rang out for miles around, but the roads from town were impassable, and no attempt could be made to send the pumpers to help. Rescuers from an adjoining farm made their way through the snowy fields. They brought ladders and formed a bucket brigade using water from the asylum's cistern. A 1934 retrospective reported it was many a day before those present could forget the scene, the blazing pile with its human occupants, the bitter wind, the snow-covered ground, the unearthly cries of the doomed. Of the 59 inmates of the asylum, men, women, and children, 10 lost their lives in the blaze. The following year, the town erected a new building for the asylum. After the devastation of the Great Fire of 1846, the island's once preeminent whaling industry began its decline and never recovered. The subsequent loss in population due to the California Gold Rush and the Civil War led to the island's further impoverishment, and it didn't revive until the beginning of the 1870s when tourism took over. As the challenges of managing the flammable substances of the business of whaling waned, along with the whaling industry itself, Nantucket moved into a new century with new challenges in fire prevention. Although the firefighting equipment and procedures were appropriately modernized to meet the demands of the new tourist economy, several significant losses by fire marked the 20th century, changing forever some of the Nantucket places much loved by visitors and islanders alike.
What began as a carefree interlude for a group of young New York socialites whose parents were summering on Nantucket ended in the ghastly deaths by fire of 2 of the young women, 1 of the young men, and a manservant. They were attending a tea party in the commodious Boathouse at the end of Commercial Wharf, owned by William Barnes, Jr., a leader in the Republican Party in New York. Barnes's son, Thurlow Weed Barnes II, a Harvard student, had invited his friends for an afternoon of refreshments and dancing to the music of phonograph records. It is conjectured that the fire started when a lighted match, or the stub of a still-burning cigarette, was tossed onto a pile of rags that had been used to polish the floors of the 2-story boathouse, igniting the rags and spreading to the oil-soaked floors, creating a conflagration. The 2 women who died had tried to escape through a door that was locked from the outside and were overcome by smoke and flames. Young Barnes and a friend, along with Barnes Sr.'s French valet, made valiant efforts to rescue them, but they were forced back by the flames and were horribly burned. The other guests survived by jumping into the water surrounding the boathouse, which was entirely consumed. The valet died later that evening. Barnes's heroic friend died within a few days, and Barnes was scarred for life. The fire spread so rapidly and with such violence that the firefighters who responded could only stand by and watch. Erected in 1891 and expanded in ensuing years, the Point Breeze Hotel on Easton Street was one of the largest of the grand hotels on Nantucket. Shortly after 2 o'clock on the morning of August 8, 1925, a blaze erupted that would prove to be one of the most catastrophic fires of all time in a Nantucket hostelry. The hotel watchman, Thomas McKean, had just made his rounds and found nothing amiss. He was in the lobby when a guest on the 3rd floor discovered the blaze. The fire began in the kitchen and soon engulfed the entire western part of the building. Pumpers arrived from the central fire station, and a hose was attached to the nearby hydrant. But the hose pulled away, and the firemen were forced to attach it to a hydrant farther up Easton Street. They labored heroically, but that portion of the hotel was gutted, and much of its older section collapsed. House guests all escaped safely to the streets, many in their nightclothes. The western section of the building was demolished, and the pavilion was rebuilt in the aftermath. The Point Breeze reopened for business on June 23, 1926. One of the worst open-land fires in Nantucket history was started shortly after 1 p.m. on July 30th, 1949. Island visitors, Mr. and Mrs. Frederick Tillestrand of New York City, were having a picnic in the woods just off Fairgrounds Road when sparks from their charcoal fire ignited pine needles that were especially dry due to a long drought. The fire spread unchecked, jumping across into the white pines of the state forest, and then with a shift of wind roaring along Old South Road, threatening several homes, including that of Roger Young and his family. The fire eventually approached the airport, melting telephone lines and cutting off communications for a time. Fire Chief Cartwright declared the fire to be out of control and gave orders to request help from Otis Air Force Base in Bourne and the Squantum Naval Base. 90-some men were flown in by the Air Force and Navy, who joined island firefighters, volunteers, and Coast Guardsmen in battling the blaze. As many as 2,000 people were involved, and firefighters succeeded in controlling the original fire after battling it for more than 8 hours. Many smaller fires broke out in the aftermath, but were eventually brought under control, with the help of light rainfall the following day. In the end, the Pinelands fire had covered an area of nearly 1,300 acres. From 1940, when Margaret Fawcett Wilson, later Barnes, purchased the building on Lower Main Street for $5,000 to house her Fawcett players, until it was destroyed by fire in 1975, the Straight Wharf Theater was home to numerous acting troupes, both community and professional. The fire was first reported at 8:50 p.m. on April 19, 1975. In spite of the valiant efforts of Nantucket firefighters, the theater burned to the ground. Neither of the abutting buildings sustained serious damage. Reggie Levine, artist and thespian, recalls the night of the fire, saying, "The first person I saw was Mac Dixon, artistic director and founder of Theater Workshop. I stood next to him and watched it burn to the ground. It was one of the worst moments of my life." The official description of the cause of the fire was never made public, though many suspected arson. The April 24, 1975 Inquirer and Mirror reported the cause as undetermined. At 2 o'clock on a bitterly cold morning, an employee of Sherman Associates was catching up on his work in the office at Zero Main when he smelled smoke and used the new 911 emergency number to summon the fire department. 60-some volunteer firefighters responded and for 15 hours battled the wind-whipped blaze, which ultimately destroyed the building that housed the offices of Walter Beinecke's Sherman Associates, along with 2 third-floor apartments, the Islander Liquor Store, Even Keel, the Lion's Paw, Key West Fabrics, the Shepherd Gallery, and Richard Sylvia's Antique Store. In addition, 50-some works of art by Nantucket artists that were being stored for the Nantucket Foundation, and several of Mr. Beinecke's favorite paintings were lost. Fire Chief Bruce Watts reported that they were unable to put out the fire because partitions, false ceilings, and false doors allowed it to creep through the walls to the 3rd floor and break out through the roof. Also, the temperature never rose above 20 degrees. Hose nozzles were caked with ice, and several firefighters suffered from frostbite. It was mid-afternoon the next day before the fire was brought under control. Arson was considered as a possible cause by state and local inspectors and insurance investigators, but no one was charged at the time. In 1981, however, a man who was being held here on a charge of larceny spontaneously confessed to setting the fire, and it was reported that he had been a suspect for more than a year. It was thought possible that the case would never be brought to trial because the suspect was subject to mental illness and not criminally responsible. Sherman Associates and Richard Sylvia declared that they would rebuild. At high noon on a fine spring day, a fire broke out in one of the island's most popular restaurants. Becoming an island institution shortly after its founding on Broad Street in 1972, the Brotherhood attracts hordes of summer visitors, In the late 19th century, the building served as a boarding house run by Mrs. George Fish, wife of the noted portrait painter. Thought to have started as a grease fire in a ventilator hood in the kitchen, the fire roared up through the second and third floors, where false walls and dropped ceilings impeded the firefighters as they sought to break through the top of the 152-year-old building. Once the firefighters had managed to create vents, huge clouds of black smoke enveloped the area. Several of the Brotherhood's employees who lived on the upper floors lost all their belongings as well as their lodgings. Doug Wolf, owner for 15 years, was desolated, commenting that it's such a great old building, half of my life is in it. Firefighter David Watts, brother of Chief Bruce Watts, suffered a heart attack shortly after the fire was controlled and died after being taken by helicopter to a Boston hospital. Repairs and rebuilding allowed the Brotherhood to reopen in time to serve its summer patrons in its customary style.